Everybody to, thank you. Welcome everybody to our February chapter meeting. Couple things we're going to talk about first, and then we're going to introduce our speaker, David Allaway. The first thing I want to talk about was we are beginning our strategic planning process. So the committee leads are going to be getting a strategic planning document that comes from national and has some of the Portland goals in it. And then we're hopefully going to turn that around in the next month or so. So maybe by March or April, we'll be able to present back the strategic goals for the chapter for 2022. And if you have any questions or want to participate in any of that in any way, contact your committee lead if you're working on a committee, or you can give me a shout or an email and see how you want to help out. And also some little administrative stuff. I'm going to pass the baton over to Allison, who is going to talk about elections. Take it away, Allison.
Hi there, hope you can hear me okay. Our elections are coming up. We hold them yearly. I'm going to present a document to you that explains some things, and then I'm going to put a link in the chat. Actually, I think I'll put the link in the chat first so you can look at it on your own if you want to peruse more slowly than my presentation. So let me grab that link. This is a bit of descriptions about the positions coming up and the timeline. So here that is being dropped into the chat. And then let me present my screen. Hopefully I can find it. Here it is. And so it's basically, well, it is this document. And so it lays out a timeline, which I will also drop into the chat for you just to kind of be mindful of. So we're hoping that you'll self-nominate for some of the positions listed here. If you want to self-nominate for a position, and there are multiple positions, you can send an email, and the email link is here for you to use. Include a picture of yourself, a short personal bio, and an explanation of why you would want to hold a position. And so let me show you the positions before I get into when the ballots go out and the like. So let's see. The chair positions are a 2-year-long position. And so currently Bill was elected last season in voting. And so that one is not available, but the vice chair position is open. And then some various leads. So committee leads, and then we get into kind of the description of each kind of lead, a technical lead, and a list of the kind of responsibilities or ideas for that position. And again, you can look on your screen if I'm going too quickly. A marketing lead, there are 2 positions for that. Responsible for all social media and other announcements.
Zooming. Definitely.
An engagement lead, responsible for all aspects of chapter involvement, including welcoming new members, ensuring all members are involved. Event leads, presentation leads, secretary that keeps notes and is doing kind of what I'm doing. A leadership committee at-large position, so you're kind of a floating position to help out where necessary, and there are 2 of those. And so number of positions available, if you have some background that would lend to that position, that would be awesome, but not necessary if you're just interested. And so these are all 1-year terms that we're hoping you'll commit to. And then the timeline. So we're hoping that you'll nominate by the 22nd. So something to consider as you leave the meeting today. Is that something you're interested in doing? So that is a week from today. We're hoping you'll have that self-nomination in. Like I said, a photo, a short personal bio, explanation of why you want to hold that position. Ballots will go out on Friday the 25th and close on the following Friday, the 4th of March. We'll send out an email reminder to make sure that you vote. And then that data will be collected and ratified by the leadership team. So we'll basically see all the data. We'll agree that the data is what it is. The voting is fully anonymous, if you're worried about that at all. And once that information is ratified by the leadership team, it'll be presented back to the membership next month's meeting, in fact. And then the chapter meeting will, or the positions will take place once those announcements are made. And so I'm going to drop all this in the chat if you need it, but this document is here for you to look at and consider if you're interested.
Hey, Allison, a question came up real quick, and this is getting a little bit detailed, but it's important because it was out there. Committee leads, technically, their focus is working on their committee, not the leadership team. So they're not an elected position. Is that correct?
That's a great question. Let me look at the bylaws really quick.
Okay, so if you don't mind, so we can make sure David gets the time he's due, can you drop your answer to that in the chat and we can let David take it away?
Got it. I already
Okay.
looked. The committee leads are not elected.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Allison, for that. And thank you for doing a great job on that. I appreciate it. Zoe, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can introduce our awesome speaker, David, today for a very interesting conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Hello, everyone. I am Zoe Serrano. You may see me posting a lot of things about the Plastic Committee. I am the lead of that. Today we have a guest speaker I am so excited about, and that is David Allaway, the Senior Policy Analyst at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. He is here to talk about the brand new Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. I think if you get excited while saying that, you get to qualify yourself as a climate activist. I'm super excited for this presentation. I'm just going to throw it on over to him so we can get started on that. And thanks again for being here, David.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe and Bill and everyone for doing what you're doing. I know just a little bit about your project and I'm excited to see it. I assume you can hear me okay. Great. Okay, let me share my screen here and we will get started. I put together a presentation. It is probably too long for the time we have here. And so I'm going to go pretty fast, but Zoe and Bill, I think at least Zoe has a copy of this. So if you want to afterwards, just ask her and she will share it with you. And my email is at the very last slide, and I'm happy to take your questions tonight and afterwards as well. Okay, so what we're hoping to do today, and saving some time at the end for questions, is just do a little bit of level setting around the climate impact of materials, take a deeper look at that old waste management hierarchy that says reduce, reuse, recycle, and confirm why reduce is more important, but also confirm the benefits of recycling. Talk a little bit about some popular wisdom that is very popular, but we're discovering is not as well informed by evidence as people assume. Then take a deeper dive into recycling and really explore some of the root problems with recycling. And then, most excitingly, share with you the new Recycling Modernization Act, which the legislature passed last summer and Governor Brown signed in August, and share with you how it addresses those root problems. Okay, so just as a little bit of background, I do work at DEQ. I'm not in the vehicle inspection program, which is how most of you interface with us. I'm also not in the climate policy office. I work in a program called Materials Management, which is an unusual program. It is guided by a policy document called the 2050 Vision. The vision in its highest summary form is shown here on the screen. It's that Oregonians produce and use materials responsibly, conserving resources, protecting the environment, and enhancing well-being. Unlike most DEQ programs that take a fairly narrow view of reducing in-state impacts from in-state activities such as transportation or industry, the materials management program takes a life cycle view of the materials that are both produced and or used in Oregon. And so that means all the stuff that gets made in other states and nations that gets imported here that we can influence through our purchasing choices is sort of in the bailiwick or the wheelhouse of our program. And that life cycle includes material extraction, manufacturing, transportation, use, and end-of-life management. Well, why does this matter? Oregon is almost unique in how we account for greenhouse gas emissions. Every state uses the same methodology, more or less, to account for its contribution to climate pollution, and that's called a sector-based inventory. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. It's a sector-based inventory, which mostly counts up all the emissions inside the state's borders, because those are what are subject to potential state regulation. Oregon does that as well. However, about 10 years ago, we recognized that that picture by itself was giving a very incomplete story of how Oregonians contribute to emissions and, by extension, opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we implemented and innovated a supplemental accounting framework called consumption-based accounting. And the consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory is an estimate of the worldwide emissions that result from our consumption here in Oregon, consumption being the root driver of economic activity and, by extension, emissions. So it's a very important perspective that most states miss out on. And in the consumption-based inventory, it turns out that our consumption of materials contributes more to global greenhouse gas emissions than our direct consumption of electricity and fuels combined. So electricity and fuels are very important, but when viewed through the lens of the consumer, materials are also very important. When we zero in just on these materials, however, we discover that only about 1% of them occur as a consequence of disposal from landfills or waste incineration. And about 99% of the emissions occur upstream in the consumer in production and supply chain. So by the time you've purchased something, almost all of the damage has been done. And there's very little that you can do to mitigate that damage once you've purchased it. Taking a closer look at consumption-based emissions, this graph shows them broken into about 16 major categories. I just want to focus on a couple. Down at the very bottom, vehicles and parts are our largest contribution to global emissions. And most of those emissions, shown in light green, are a consequence of using our vehicles. But a non-trivial portion in dark green are a consequence we call it pre-purchase. That's the emissions from making the car and the tires and the engine and all that stuff. But right up above that, the second largest contribution to emissions is food and beverages. And almost all of that is a consequence of production. Those are on-farm and factory emissions, and I'll zero in on those in a moment. Continuing up the line, we have appliances such as furnaces. That's mostly about using them. Services. Services are not particularly emissions intensive, but Oregonians spend a lot of money on services. And then construction. So when it comes to materials, it is food and construction materials that contribute the most. But you invited me to talk about packaging. So where's packaging in all of this? Well, unfortunately, packaging is a little bit hard to see because packaging is associated with all of these different categories of consumption. But let's zero in just on food. This is from a report that's available on our website that looks at the carbon footprint of a variety of different kinds of foods. And in orange, you see the average carbon footprint for producing the food. In blue, the carbon footprint of food manufacturing. And in green, the average carbon footprint of packaging. So packaging is not trivial from a greenhouse gas perspective, but it really pales in comparison to the impacts of the products themselves. So from a climate perspective, packaging, it's not trivial, but it's not hugely important. However, packaging is really important from a couple of other perspectives, especially if you're aware with what's going on with marine plastics in the oceans. I'll come back to that in a minute. Recycling is the most popular solution to reduce impacts of materials, and it is beneficial. We estimate that a few years ago, kind of a typical year, recycling by Oregonians saved about 27 trillion BTUs of energy. That's equivalent to about 220 million gallons of gasoline, or it reduced greenhouse gas emissions by the equivalent of tailpipe emissions from about 700,000 average passenger cars. And for a state with a population just over 4 million, that is not trivial. It's not transformational, but it's not trivial. So it's a meaningful benefit. And most of these greenhouse gas reductions are upstream. They're a consequence of when waste, paper, metal, and plastics get used by industry to make new products in lieu of virgin resources. That's the primary environmental benefit of recycling. It's not about reducing impacts from landfills or incinerators, because those are pretty small, relatively speaking. So recycling is beneficial, but it's also very limited. We've picked most of the low-hanging fruit. We need to keep picking them, but there's not a tremendous amount more we can do. And so if we want to achieve deeper cuts gaps in the emissions associated with materials, we need recycling, but we need some additional strategies. And one of them, of course, is the reduce, reuse part of reduce, reuse, recycle. And I have a great example to illustrate the importance of this. And the example involves different methods of delivering drinking water. So this chart here shows 5 different types of environmental impacts, global warming on the left, there's some others as well. Over the life cycle, it means everything from extracting the raw materials all the way through to disposal, for drinking water out of a PET single-use bottle. In blue, we have a bottle recycled, if bottles were recycled at a rate of 37% statewide, in red, 62%. These happen to be the recycling rates for water bottles before and after they were added to the Oregon bottle bill. So you can see that expanding the bottle bill to include drinking water resulted in a very modest reduction in environmental benefits. It was a fine thing to do. It was not transformational. So are there some other solutions? Yes, there are. Industry in the last 10 years has found ways to make their bottles very thin, very lightweight. They're almost more like bags now if you've ever, used one of these, like if you're traveling or something. And that's called lightweighting. And here in green, we show the relative impacts of a lighter weight plastic bottle. So that's great. It's still not enough. And fortunately, there are some other activities. Consumers, individuals, can drink water out of the tap in a reusable bottle. And we show one version of those impacts in aqua. Now, what I'm showing here in aqua actually happens to be the very worst case scenario we could imagine for tap water. Specifically, what it involves is a household drinking their water out of a bottle like this and washing it. Sorry, I don't know if you can see it. There we go. Washing it every single day in the model of home dishwasher, which by the greatest margin ever failed to qualify for the EPA Energy Star label. The worst energy and water hog of a dishwasher that has been legally sold in the United States. And if you have the misfortune of having that in your house, you get these results here in aqua. But if you're like me and you wash your bottle once a week in an Energy Star dishwasher, you get results shown in orange and squint. They're almost impossible to see because they are almost zero relative to the impacts of drinking water out of a recyclable bottle and recycling it. But they are there, we calculated them. And so this, I hope, illustrates the importance of the reduce, reuse part of reduce, reuse, recycle. Okay, I would love to stop for questions, but I'm just gonna plow through this and trust we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Hope that's okay. Okay, cool. Okay, so this leads to a very important and somewhat counterintuitive finding, which is it's important, it's beneficial to recycle, it's even better to use less. Now, because plastics have a number of issues around them, this has led a number of people to say, well, we should just not use any plastics at all. And there is a potential hazard here. There's a bit of a trade-off. And I want to illustrate this with an example involving coffee and the packaging of coffee. So if you go to the store and you buy coffee beans, most typically they're going to be packaged in 1 or 3 formats. There's the old Folgers can, which is a steel can, no plastic there. There's a plastic tub, a rigid plastic tub. And then there's this laminate multi-material filmy bag type thing, which typically is very difficult to recycle. The steel can and the plastic tub are recyclable in the Portland area. The steel can is recyclable statewide. The plastic tub is not. The laminate bag is not recyclable anywhere in this country. And because it's not recyclable, many people assume it's a bad choice. But the thing about the laminate bag is it uses so little material. And remember, most of the impacts of materials are a consequence of production. So if you use less material, your impacts are going to be lower. So what we're showing here are the relative impacts, and global warming is shown as well, of these 3 different packaging formats. We've given the steel can and the plastic tub a very optimistic recycling scenario where 80% of all those packages get recycled statewide. And even then, they end up with a higher carbon footprint than that plastic laminate metal bag thing, which gets sent to the landfill. So just a word of caution here around trade-offs between materials. And it turns out that this particular example is not at all atypical. We went out a couple years ago and evaluated 17 years worth of academic literature evaluating the life cycle impacts of different packaging materials. We found 520 different comparisons where a recyclable package was compared against a non-recyclable package. And what we found was roughly half of the time, the recyclable package had a higher environmental impact. And in roughly half the time, in green, the recyclable package had a lower environmental impact. And this has nothing to do with recycling, because the impact of recycling is fairly small. The reason that some packages are better and some packages are worse is because of what they're made of, how they're made, and how much material is used. So it turns out that recyclability is a very poor predictor of environmental impact. And the same is true for compostability, where we found 620 comparisons. And more often than not, a compostable package actually increases environmental impacts. And that's one of many reasons why Oregon's compost industry has said, we don't want compostable packaging. Even though composting of food waste and yard debris is a beneficial thing, the packaging creates a whole host of problems for them, which I won't go into here. It's a little off topic, but I wanted to share this with you. You can read it at your leisure. Okay. Whew. So that was your primer. And I'm sorry if I went very fast, but I now want to pivot and talk about the Recycling Modernization Act, which is a comprehensive reform of the recycling system, but we managed to get into it a few non-recycling elements as well, because recycling is necessary. It needs to be done well. It's also inadequate. And so this act, you can think of it as sort of recycling plus. The most important thing to know about this act is it's a shared responsibility model. And for the first time in the history of this country, it will obligate producers to share in the responsibility for an effective, modernized, responsible recycling system. And by producers, I'm talking about brands such as Coca-Cola, Kraft, Johnson & Johnson, as well as e-commerce retailers such as Amazon. So let me explain how it will work. But first, just a little bit of background. Some of you might have heard back in 2017 that China, who had been accepting about 40% of all the collected recyclables worldwide, closed their door. And the reason they closed their door is because everyone, including the US, was shipping them bales of paper and other materials that were badly contaminated with plastic. And this plastic was piling up in the Chinese countryside and creating very real human health and environmental impacts. China slammed its doors. The entire recycling system went upside down. The state went into a crisis. We kind of developed some temporary solutions, but the crisis exposed a number of fundamental weaknesses in Oregon's decades-old recycling policy. So in 2018, my office convened a recycling steering committee and chartered it with making recommendations to modernize Oregon's decades-old recycling laws. That committee held close to 100 meetings over 27 months. It operated by principles of consensus, which was incredibly difficult, but in the end, fruitful. The committee found consensus on a recommendation to modernize Oregon's policy. DEQ took that recommendation and drafted a legislative concept. It got subsequently introduced into the legislature, where it was heavily debated, amended, and passed both chambers with 0 vote margins in both chambers, and then went on to be signed by the governor in August. So before I explain to you what the law does, I just want to highlight some of the root challenges with the recycling system. First of all, the public is very confused about what to recycle, and that confusion is a root driver of contamination. Contamination is the garbage that doesn't belong in the recycling system. And it creates very real problems for the recycling system. Removing it is expensive. And if you don't remove it, then end markets such as paper mills might close their doors on recycling. And this is a very significant issue. 89% of people who live in the metro region, including probably some of us on this call, believe that they can recycle and put in their blue bins materials that the recycling system is not prepared to recycle or manage. So this is a very pervasive problem, and it really undermines the economics of domestic recycling, which is what leads to this issue of exports. So when the domestic mills will no longer use our recyclables because they're too dirty, we ship them off to countries like Indonesia, where they may be dumped or burned, harming people and the planet. These are pictures of plastics that were dumped in the countryside from an Indonesian paper mill that was buying bales of paper out of the United States. So this is not a failure of plastics recycling. This is a failure of the larger recycling system, including contamination here at home and our failure to adequately remove it before we send stuff abroad. So this in turn threatens public confidence in the recycling system, and governments lack the means to ensure that the materials collected are actually being recycled and that they're being recycled in ways that are actually beneficial. So related to this problem is a historic disconnect in responsibility. Producers, such as the consumer brands, they specify and they choose and they label all this packaging and printed paper, but are largely absent from responsibility for recycling it. Instead, local governments and their garbage ratepayers, that's you and me, bear the brunt of funding and operating recycling systems. Through our garbage rates, we heavily subsidize the supply chains of producers, but they face we subsidize the supply chains of producers, while the recycling system is facing very steep economic headwinds because the price signals in recycling markets don't account for the social benefits of recycling, such as the cost of carbon. Unfortunately, recyclables are competing against subsidized virgin feedstocks, such as shale gas, and the prices that commodity markets pay for waste paper and plastics are heavily volatile and unstable, and again, fail to account for the social impacts. When market prices don't reflect impacts, such as pollution, the result is an underinvestment in recycling, and that's what we have in this country today. So with that as context, the Recycling Steering Committee worked through some very difficult challenges and found consensus on a proposal that became the Modernization Act. As I mentioned, this will be the first extended producer responsibility law for packaging and printed paper to be implemented in the US. And let me explain briefly how it will work. So first of all, producers, of covered products, which are defined to include packaging, printed paper, and food serviceware, will be required to join and make payments to a producer responsibility organization, or PRO. The PRO is a nonprofit membership organization that serves its producer members. It's kind of like a co-op. The PRO will receive funds from its members and then disperse the funds in order to fund necessary upgrades and perform other functions to make the recycling system more convenient, accessible, and responsible. And producers will pay in proportion to how much materials they put into the Oregon market, as well as what those materials are. And it doesn't matter if the producer is in Oregon or some other state, it treats them all the same. So it creates a level playing field between in-state businesses and their out-of-state competition. Producer support will make it possible to create a new statewide, consistent, uniform recycling collection list that will make recycling services consistent across the entire state. Local governments will maintain their current role overseeing collection and take on new responsibilities to expand collection services and carry out new programs to help reduce contamination. Materials will be directed to processing facilities, the sorting facilities, that will meet new permit requirements before being sent only to end markets that can handle the materials responsibly. All this will be overseen by DEQ, will hold producers accountable where necessary, and a new advisory council will review important elements and advise DEQ and the PROs. So now to get into a few finer details, the state's going to establish this one uniform statewide list of recyclable items to make recycling easier and clearer for everyone. So whatever what you can recycle at home will be the same as what you recycle at work, and the same when you go visit your relatives down in Salem or Eugene or Medford or Pendleton. There will also be better information for people that speak languages other than English. DEQ is going to create this list with involvement from stakeholders, and we have to consider technological, environmental, economic, and social factors. The PROs will pay the cost of transporting recyclables if they have to go more than 50 miles to a processing facility, and that, coupled with the uniform statewide list, is going to expand and better meet the needs of rural Oregon. And it's going to make recycling no more expensive in rural Oregon than it is in Portland, because that's not the case today. Local governments that want to expand collection services can do so. After collection, commingled recyclables are sent to these processing facilities that sort out all this stuff that we've mixed together. And under the law, local governments will be required to send their commingled materials to facilities that are either permitted or certified. And these standards will include standards for sorting quality, managing and removing contaminants, reporting on final destination of materials, and paying workers a living wage and providing supportive benefits. The PROs will pay processing facilities some fees. I won't go into the detail here other than to say that the fees are designed to protect ratepayers, that's you and me, from the volatility of commodity markets, because it's that volatility that has caused local governments to drop recycling services, the volatility in prices. So that volatility will be shifted over to the accounts of the PROs. Producers will also be required to operate some supplemental collection options because certain materials such as film plastics are recyclable, but they create havoc when you put them in the commingled bin. They're really incompatible with our processing technology and they cause everything to get tangled and gummed up. So there will be more, for example, return to retail opportunities. The producers will also be held to progressively increasing and mandatory plastic packaging recycling goals. And very importantly, the PROs will be required to work with the other system participants to ensure that all materials that are collected for recycling are recycled at responsible in markets and in ways that allow us to assure the people of Oregon that the materials were actually being recycled and in environmentally responsible ways. In total, we project that the Act will increase funding for recycling by around $800 million per decade in perpetuity, so long as the Act doesn't get amended. So that's a pretty big number. A couple of other details I want to mention. We're required to conduct some, well, let me step back a moment. We had proposed in the original legislation even more obligations for the PROs. We wanted to have them pay for litter prevention and cleanup programs. That got turned into a study. So we're going to do a study and make recommendations to the legislature. We have to do a periodic study of equity in the recycling system. There's a truth and labeling task force that is currently meeting to make recommendations to address the issue of confusing labels. And now some very important and precedent-setting elements. At present, producers make claims about compostability or recyclability of their packaging. But as we demonstrated, those don't actually mean much and they don't correlate with actual environmental benefits. What would mean something would be, for example, a calculation of the carbon footprint. And so this Act requires the PROs to set their fee structures on their members in a way that create incentives for producers to choose more environmentally responsible materials and to evaluate and disclose impacts such as carbon footprint. The Act also requires the 25 largest producers to evaluate and disclose the carbon and other environmental footprints of their of a small percentage of their portfolio. It's a small percentage, but this is entirely precedent setting. The idea that the state would require producers to pull back the veil and reveal to the public the actual environmental impacts of their supply chains and their manufacturing. And finally, the Act requires the PROs to fund waste prevention and reuse projects. For example, replacing disposable dishware in school cafeterias. And once fully up and running in 2029, this will be, by our estimate, the largest dedicated fund for reuse and reduce in the history of the United States. So again, some very precedent-setting stuff here. Very quickly, how are we doing on time? I'm almost done. I wanted to mention that the Act has a couple of really important equity considerations. Very briefly, it's going to make collection more accessible to people across the state. It will improve recycling opportunities in multifamily settings. It will make public education more accessible. It will protect the several hundred facility workers who work in these processing facilities. They're generally people of color. They're at the very low end of the economic ladder, and they have to sort syringes and diapers by hand out from all the recyclables you're putting in your bin. So it's going to help protect them and it's going to provide them with a living wage as well. It's going to ensure responsible exports by placing requirements on outbound bale quality and prohibiting recyclables or contamination from being sent to unverified end markets. Going to ensure better representation and establish a continuous improvement model by requiring a study every 4 years of equity in the recycling system and recommendations for how to improve. So I hope you can see how the Act solves these root challenges, should reduce public confusion, it will reduce contamination and better manage that contamination. It will ensure responsible recycling through these in-market requirements. And by requiring producers to ensure responsible in markets and pay for a portion of system costs, the Act fixes this misalignment between market prices and social benefits. It forces the producers to internalize the costs of pollution or some of the pollution onto their balance sheets, and that makes it more economical for them to do the right thing for society. I'm not going to go into the details of how this thing gets implemented. It doesn't really go into effect until July 1st of 2025 because this act is without precedent and requires a whole bunch of administrative rulemakings and some other processes before we can actually hit the launch button, but we're hard at work. We are hiring. We've got a couple positions open right now. So if you're interested, please let us know. And check out our website, which is here. And there's also several forms you can fill out if you want to get periodic updates about this, or if there's specific pieces of the project you're interested in and would like to engage in. So with that, I wanted to make time for questions, and I'll stop yakking at you and be happy to hear what your questions are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm sure everyone else got as much amazing information as I did from that. We've already got quite a few questions, so if you don't mind, I think we'll just jump right into it.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So we're going to start off with, can you recycle wax or cardboard milk containers?
That's a great question. So these milk containers, as well as the aseptic cartons like soy and oat milk, are actually coated with polyethylene. And if they're shelf stable, that is like not the milk cartons, but the soy milk containers, they also have a layer of aluminum. So yes, they can be recycled in the Portland area. The communities outside the Portland area don't currently recycle them. They're not the easiest material to recycle. They are actually a pretty good material from a life cycle carbon footprint perspective, even if you end up disposing of them, again, because of how they're made and how little material is used. But our best understanding at present is that, yes, they can be recycled. We have some questions about the recycling process that we just put to the paper industry a couple days ago. So I can't tell you all the details yet, but we're definitely looking into it because this act requires us to identify the list of materials that will be accepted for recycling statewide. And milk cartons are sort of right on the edge of yes or no. We've got some information to gather before we make a final decision there. But for now, yes.
Perfect. The next question we've got for you is, how does the state of Oregon regulate combined packaging going from other states or countries?
Let me look at the chat because I don't completely understand the question. How do we
And that one
regulate?
won't be in the chat. Maybe Bill can elaborate.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking like, so Oregon is going to be regulating packaging for any product that comes into Oregon, right?
Yes.
How do you do that? Is it just like you can't sell it here?
Yep.
Or
That's it.
kind of simple, right? Okay.
That's it. Ultimately, I
answer.
mean, you might know, or you might have used at some time in the last few years, the state's e-cycles program, or the state's paint care program, where you can take paint back, or you can take old TVs back. These operate on the same principle. They're called extended producer responsibility. There's a new program that launched in July of last year for waste medicines. You'll start seeing kiosks popping up around the state where you can drop off your waste pharmaceuticals. These are all operated by PROs that are largely made up of out-of-state manufacturing interests who are obligated because they sell items into the state of Oregon. So this is the exact same principle. It's just on a bigger and more ambitious scale.
Thank you.
From Bill Davis, we have a question asking, the petrochemical industry is doubling down on plastics production over the next decade to make up for lost revenue as autos electrify. How does this act manage that volume?
Yes, they are definitely more than doubling plastics production. I think the forecast is that they're going to triple it in the next couple of decades. That is a fundamental sort of economic issue that the state of Oregon cannot solve, but we do think that the act takes a couple of meaningful steps. First of all, the act requires the users of those plastics, like the consumer goods companies, to pay these fees to the PRO, and they have to pay fees based on different materials. And the act is very interesting in that it prohibits the PROs from cross-subsidizing materials, which means the PROs will have to set a fee schedule for different materials, and the fees on paper will have to be designed to pay for the cost of paper. And the fees on plastic will have to be calculated to pay for the cost of plastic. And it's the plastic that's expensive. So the fees on plastic will be more expensive. And that's going to make the use of plastic more expensive. And that might put some dent. I'm not saying it's going to make the curve go down, but it should make some dent in the use of plastic in the first place. Then a 50% recycling goal for plastic, which is enforceable, will provide more feedstocks that the industry can use in lieu of virgin feedstocks, and they'll have to use it because of the responsible and market requirement. And then finally, this reduce reuse program that I mentioned, $8 million a year is not that's about what it will generate. It's not a lot of money, but it's one of the few pieces of the act that will be administered by the state, not the producers, because frankly, we don't entirely trust the producers to spend money in effective ways to reduce the purchase of their own products. But we think that's something the state could actually do pretty well. And we've got some pretty exciting ideas for how we can shift markets and reduce the use of plastics and other single-use packaging. So this act does not solve the fundamental problem, which is cheap natural gas, federal subsidies, and the failure of our society to put a price on carbon. But for what Oregon can do, because we don't have a petrochemical industry here, I think the act takes a number of very meaningful steps, and we could probably do more, but it was hard enough to pass the act just as it was. So one step at a time, or maybe two. Thanks.
Understandable.
Yeah.
So the next question from Karen, is styrofoam dealt with in this act, i.e. outlawed?
Styrofoam is not outlawed. It's dealt with like any other material, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation in the next couple of months about whether or not we want to require the PROs to set up effective depots around the state for people to bring their styrofoam. At present, the only place you can take it is Agilex, which is in Tigard, and if you're located anywhere else, like even Portland, it's not very convenient. So we could require the PROs to set up like depots, places where you could take your polystyrene back. But before we do that, we actually want to make sure that it makes environmental sense. Polystyrene, that's the technical name for it. Expanded polystyrene is largely air. It is mostly air. And driving trucks around the state that are full of air might not be a good thing from a greenhouse gas perspective. We have a study underway to evaluate how far you can actually transport expanded polystyrene before the transportation emissions eliminate any benefit you get from recycling. And that's actually a very difficult question to answer because very little is known about the environmental impacts or benefits of the Agilex process. Although this act, starting in 2025, will require Agilex to start revealing more about its environmental impacts. So we will get there, and it's going to be a journey. And I wish we had the answer today, but again, apologies that we don't, but we haven't had the tools. We haven't had the tools until now.
Well, that'll be exciting to see what comes of that. So we have a question from Bernadette. What is the response from the producers? Do big producers, especially out of state, threaten that this will raise prices? And if so, do you think that that's likely?
Okay, there's actually three different questions there. So, well, maybe two. So the response from producers has been all over the map. Generally speaking, most producers opposed the legislation, but there were a handful who supported it. And in principle, a larger number of producers are now warming up to this idea of producer responsibility. So the producers are highly balkanized on this topic, and they're really, again, all over the map. We had, for example, New Seasons and Bob's Red Mill, two Oregon producers who both openly endorsed the act because this is going to help them and their customers manage packaging waste. They're going to realize some benefit from it because they're going to be able, as Oregon businesses, they'll be able to take advantage and use these new recycling services. And also they want to do the right thing, and they want their packaging, they want effective recycling systems for their packaging where it makes sense to recycle them. And where it doesn't, that's okay too. So is this going to raise costs for producers? Yes, probably, but not as much as they threatened it would. Before we proposed this legislation, we did a little research project involving Canada. Canada is an incredible laboratory for EPR because some Canadian provinces have a very similar policy as this one, and neighboring provinces don't. So what we did is we did a comparison shopping study where we found items that were sold by the same retailer in neighboring provinces with and without EPR. The report is on our website. So for example, Vlasic pickles sold by Walmart in Calgary and Vancouver. Calgary is in Alberta, they don't have EPR. Vancouver is in BC, they do have EPR. And we found no meaningful correlation between the presence or absence of EPR policies and consumer prices. That doesn't mean that prices aren't raised. Sometimes they are, but more often than not, we believe producers will raise prices on their global consumer base and not the Oregon consumer base. And that's actually justified as a way of funding a portion of Oregon's recycling system, because a lot of the environmental and human health benefits of recycling by Oregonians actually don't occur here in Oregon. They occur in other parts of the globe. As a commissioner in a coastal county put it to me, he said, yeah, I want to recycle my glass, but there's no environmental or human health benefit to the residents of my county from recycling glass. That's reducing pollution someplace else. Why should we pay for it? And I said, exactly, because for the last 30 years, your residents have been paying for recycling of glass. And with the passage of this bill, now a fraction of those costs are going to get redistributed to other people, including some of the people who will benefit. So yes, this does have the potential of increasing consumer prices. And we believe it is justified because, and we did a study, I didn't share the results with you, but we found that a modest investment of about $80 million a year in improving and expanding recycling would reduce pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, human health, air particulate, carcinogenics. And we put a dollar figure on those because all that pollution has very real economic impacts. It leads to disability and illness and death. And it leads to climate change, which wipes out crops and causes heat domes and causes more people to die. And there's economic consequences to all this, but the problem is none of it is reflected in market prices. So we estimated what those economic value was, and we found that it was significantly greater than the $80 million. So the idea here is it's about an $80 million a year investment in recycling that will lead to reductions in human health, pollutants, and climate change that is valued at more than $80 million. So it passes what we call the cost benefit test, and it's justified. And yes, somebody has to pay for it because at present, we are all paying for it. We are all paying for climate pollution. We are all paying for plastics in the ocean because it's causing illness and disability and death. So we're all paying for it now. We're just going to pay for it in a different way when we go to the grocery store.
That definitely makes sense. Okay, so this next question is a little bit longer, so I'm going to ask it in two parts. Also, just to throw it out there, we're looking for about 5 to 10 more minutes on the Q&A. I'm super excited about how the discussion's going. So the first part is, will right to repair ever be part of the legislation, or is that in another category?
Right to repair, which I think has great potential, is not in this act. It's been introduced several times. And it's not part of this act. This act was focused on primarily recycling of packaging and printed paper.
What would you add to the 2.0 version of this bill? Are there opportunities to strengthen the bill through the rulemaking process?
Definitely. I think the bill, we proposed a bill that was better than what passed, although actually very little of the good stuff got stripped out. We would like to see greater producer responsibility for managing and reducing marine debris and litter. We'd like to see better language around compostable packaging and protecting the compost industry from sort of fake compostables. We would like to see more investment in fixing the physical infrastructure for recycling at multi-tenant buildings, apartment complexes, et cetera. But at this point, most of the good stuff in the bill is still in the bill, it's still in the act, and now we just need to realize it through the rulemaking process and implementation.
Are there other states following Oregon's lead in terms of this act or something similar?
Yeah, Maine passed EPR legislation this last year as well. Their legislation is very different from ours. It requires the PROs to pay 100% of the cost of the recycling system, but it doesn't mandate any improvements to the recycling system. So put differently, the Maine law funds all of the existing programs in Maine. The Oregon law surgically fixes the pieces of what's not working in Oregon and then has the producers fix those. So those are the two models out there right now. And at present, New York, California, New York and California both have very active legislation that's going on right now. And then Washington, Maryland, Colorado, potentially Connecticut, and a handful of other states are not too far behind.
So what were the main arguments in opposition to this law?
Well, the main arguments were based on a series of untruths, and I don't really want to repeat them because they weren't legitimate. So in terms of the sort of legitimate arguments, the producers felt that they had not been sufficiently, they hadn't been at the table. I mentioned this recycling steering committee, which was largely made up of Oregon interests, local governments, recyclers, some Oregon businesses, and the big national producers weren't at the table, so they felt excluded. They also didn't want to fund certain pieces of the program. They were willing to fund portions of it, but not all of it. And again, they're not funding all of the future system. They're just funding about 28%. The producers threatened that this is going to increase costs for consumers. And I just want to point out the Canadian study, I'm trying to find it. It's not the OECD study that someone put in the link, but it's on our website. I mean, it did find that on average, the price of consumer goods in the Canadian provinces with EPR was about 0.4 cents higher than the cost of consumer goods in Canadian provinces without EPR. But then that got sort of blown out of proportion and turned into something that no real economist thought was legitimate. What else? The producers don't want 50 different state laws. They want uniformity. And we've been waiting 30 years for the federal government to solve this problem. So enough of that waiting. And at some point, we believe once enough states do pass similar laws, then there will be a federal solution. But that's how environmental policy in this country works these days, is the states lead. And once enough states do something, then the federal government eventually comes in behind and cleans it up.
We have two more questions. So the first one from Bill is, has the state of Oregon been working with the paper industry to promote biodegradable solutions like brown paper packaging as a plastic alternative? As a leading timber state, they would think that this is a significant business opportunity for the paper industry.
Yes, it is a significant opportunity for the paper industry. They are already very heavily promoting the benefits of paper, and they don't need our help doing that. Paper has some advantages over plastic, and in certain applications, it actually has some disadvantages. Depending on what environmental impact you're trying to reduce, paper's not always the best choice. And biodegradable is an attribute that also, it has some unintended consequences. So 40 years ago, when it looked like we were going to run out of landfill capacity in this country, biodegradable packaging was all the craze, because it was going to degrade in the landfill, and it was going to conserve landfill space, and it was going to extend the life of our landfills. But this state here in Oregon, we have hundreds of years of landfill capacity. We don't need waste to biodegrade. in landfills. And the problem with biodegradation in landfills is actually a greenhouse gas problem. Very basic science here. When wastes degrade in a landfill, matter is not destroyed. The molecules, the atoms don't disappear. They're just converted into some other form. I'm putting the Canada grocery cost study in the chat right now. When waste degrade in a landfill, they produce methane. And methane, as you know, is a very potent greenhouse gas. And landfills capture some of it and use it as an energy source, but some of it escapes to the atmosphere. So, we want waste to biodegrade if they end up in the oceans, but most of our garbage does not end up in the ocean. It ends up in landfills. So biodegradability isn't the entirely desirable attribute that you might assume it is from a climate perspective. Sorry.
Yeah, it's unfortunate once you start looking into it a little deeper like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of popular wisdom in this field, and it's all very popular, and it's not all informed by evidence.
Mhm.
Has
Okay.
there been any comparison between plastic and the life cycle of plastic, and that it doesn't biodegrade, period, it just breaks down, versus, like, has anyone compared the apple to the orange?
Yeah,
Or-
absolutely, absolutely. And in the marine environment, paper breaks down and is relatively harmless, and plastics do not. So if I were designing materials policy for a country like Indonesia that lacks solid waste infrastructure, I'd be all in on paper, and I'd be very negative on plastics. But in this country, we have landfills, and although everyone loves to hate them, landfills were designed to achieve a very specific purpose, and that was to keep waste out of the environment. And landfills do an excellent job at that. And when we put plastics in landfills, we might not feel good about it, but the landfills do an excellent job at keeping the plastics out of the environment. And they don't degrade unless they're a degradable plastic, which is a whole other can of worms. So, and yeah, there have actually been evaluations of degradable plastics, which have found that when you put them in a landfill, they're like greenhouse gases on steroids. They produce a significant amount of methane. And if they're degradable plastics and you try to recycle them, then that upsets the recycling process, because plastics today are recycled into products such as house siding and decking and strapping used by railroads and piping that's used in irrigation systems. And if you introduce these biodegradable additives that are designed to break molecular bonds when exposed to oxygen or water, then you have recycled products that fail. You have decks that collapse and house siding that melts. And so the issue with biodegradability is that it potentially increases greenhouse gas emissions, and it's incompatible with plastics recycling processes. So we have sort of an uneasy truce with biodegradability. We love biodegradability in certain applications, like soaps and detergents and parts of the world that don't have a solid waste infrastructure. But in this country, we have a solid waste infrastructure. Most people use it, most wastes go into it, and biodegradability has some unintended consequences. And I'm sorry, one last thing here. Biodegradability has nothing to do with being bio-based. People confuse them a lot. If it's biodegradable, that means it comes from plants, and if it comes from plants, it's natural, and therefore it's good. But there are plastics that are made from petroleum that are degradable. There are plastics made from plants that are not degradable. There are compostable plastics that compost in a compost facility, but they don't degrade in the ocean. There are certain degradable plastics that degrade in the ocean, but don't degrade in a compost facility. It's unfortunately very, very complicated. And these simple attributes that we grab at don't correlate well with each other. It's really regrettable, and it makes my head explode, but it's the reality we have to deal with.
Well, thank you so much, David. You gave us all so much great information to take away. And I, for one, am excited to see how this develops over the next 5 years. And I'm just even more excited to see it put into action. Maybe you could drop your email in the chat just in case anyone had any further questions. I know we just have to wrap it up right now. But once again, thanks so much for being here. This was just such a great presentation. We're going to toss it back over to Bill.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Zoe. We have going on in Oregon a very short legislative session. And we have a new leader of our legislative committee, Karen Harrington, who wanted to give kind of a really quick update as to what's going on in this really short session because it's super intense and she is working hard. So go ahead, Karen, and give us a quick update.
Just real quick, thank you, Bill. And thank you, Zoe and David. That was a super interesting presentation. I hope we can get the recording of it. It's a lot of good information. So legislation, this is, I think, the newest committee of Climate Reality Portland. And I think it's just so critical that we're now really focusing on this. There's actually two leaders. Brian Romer is the co-chair, so we're doing it together. And we're fledgling, right? We just started right before this 5-week session started. I'm going to just show you in chat. I'm going to put a link to a spreadsheet. It's a Google sheet. Gives you an idea of how we're getting organized just really quickly to be up and running for this session. So what we did is we chose 5 bills that we thought had the most impact and related mostly to the issue of emissions, which is what Climate Reality is all about. So we chose those 5 bills, and the spreadsheet shows you how we're tracking them and the actions that we have taken to date. This is updated every couple days, so it's, I'll look at it after the meeting tonight, and I'm sure I'll have some more things to add. But you can see we've been really busy getting to know what the bills are all about, how to support them, giving testimony on the bills, and oral and written to make our mark. So I think that's a pretty good start. And we are in collaboration. We're doing, well, I can't really say we're working with these other organizations yet. We haven't had that opportunity, but talking to organizations like Families for Climate and SOCAN and Climate Solutions, some of the Oregon nonprofits that really are doing great legislative work, and that we're able to share their information to really help give us kind of a kickstart as we're starting this off. We'd love to have more members join. Let me put my email in the chat. And let me know if you'd be interested in joining our group. You don't have to have any expertise in this. We're all learning together. So we would love to have your support. What else? We're really focused on this session. We're in week 3. There's 2 more to go. And so this is what we're doing right now. Once we're done with this session, we have some time to really build our skills, to come up, to have an organized group, get to know our representatives so we can have those relationships and, build our impact even on a greater level. I really believe legislation's where it's at, and at the local or the state level, as since federal's not moving too quickly. And we all know the clock is ticking, and this has the potential to have some pretty big impact. So everybody's welcome. Call me with any questions. Okay, thanks, Bill. Yeah, are there any questions?
Okay, thanks, Karen. Zoe, you had a quick presentation, I guess you wanted to give?
Yeah, well, I'll just throw it out there. I just put together a couple slides of some takeaway resources. Anyone who wants to stick around, it'll just be about 5 or so minutes. I've got some links to share in the chat. Just in terms of plastic reduction, leading the committee over the past couple of months, I've gotten a lot of really awesome things sent my way. So I just wanted to share some stuff with you guys. Again, feel free to leave if you need to. I know it's getting pretty late. Otherwise, I'm just going to pop onto my screen and get into it, if that's okay. Unless, Bill, did you have anything?
No, I wanted to make sure that we can get back in touch with David to make sure that we can ask him, what can we do to help his situation? So we will be doing that, and we'll probably bring it back the next monthly meeting. if he has anything big he wants us to do.
And also we'll include that in the newsletter if we get that back before then. Yep, perfect. Okay, well, I am just gonna share my screen really quickly. Perfect. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Okay, is everyone able to see my screen? Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so I just wanted to start off very quickly. I just wanted to share some of my most favorite plastic-free swaps that I've just done in my life. I wanted to start off on an individual level in terms of plastic reduction. These are all things that have saved me just money and make me feel a little bit better about my decisions. So next time you're running out of something, maybe you can make the decision to invest in something plastic-free in terms of a replacement. Just a nice little thing to plant in the back of your mind as you're going on kind of a climate conscious journey. So for the kitchen, I love plant-based scrub brushes and sponges. Dish soap blocks are awesome. Non-Tox Life has a really cool dish soap block. It takes care of grease, super cool. Beeswax wraps are really awesome to use instead of plastic wrap, and that's a super fun DIY project you can do. Tons of resources online for this. Again, just planting a seed. In terms of food, reusable cutlery and straw sets, bringing your own cups, your own containers. I'm sure a lot of us already think about this, but for those who don't, it's really awesome to start building habits. Just leave some of these things in your car. That way you can't forget it, and it kind of sparks you to actually make that change. Reusable produce bags. That was the first thing I changed ever in my plastic-free journey and my favorite swap. In terms of lifestyle, shampoo and conditioner bars. High Bar is a really awesome brand from Minnesota, which is my home state. If you haven't heard the long O's, you may have guessed. Again, that's High Bar. Safety razors are really cool. So you don't need a plastic razor. You actually get to recycle the metal blades that these come with. They're a little more dangerous to use, but they're really awesome in terms of plastic reduction. And then something cool that's been coming on the market are refillable deodorants and makeup. That's something, there's a lot of cool companies coming out. You'll probably see that in your feeds on social media or in the news. Something a little more relevant. I wanted to share with you some plastic-free shops and initiatives in Portland. So some bulk refill shops that I've been talking to the owners of and are really cool are listed here. I'm going to send in the chat a whole list of links. I forgot to do that, but I'll do it at the end of this. So we've got No Refillery, Utility Refill and Reuse, Simple Sundries. I definitely would recommend taking a screenshot of this or looking at the links I send. All of these places offer different items, but they've got shampoos, they've got conditioners, lotions, cleaning supplies, plant-based scrub brushes, dish soap blocks. So a lot of the things I mentioned in the first slide, a lot of these places actually do carry, and you can get it in bulk. Liquid shampoo and conditioner, that's an easier swap than a bar. So it's really interesting to look into some of these places and to support local and to support these initiatives, because we want to tell them we love what they're doing and we want plastic reduction and plastic-free items to kind of become the norm. In terms of initiatives, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with these two really cool companies, but GoBox is a reusable and returnable to-go wear program. So you actually download an app. There's participating locations all over Portland. You check out reusable to-go containers, get your food in it, and then within 2 weeks, you just drop it off at a participating location. It's super easy to use, really cool to kind of plan where you're eating out around what locations they have, just to show some support to businesses who are doing that. The next one is Okapi Reusables. They have reusable and returnable to-go cups. So they're in coffee shops and I think one juice shop. So you get to get your drink in a reusable cup. You just drop it off within 2 weeks, similar to GoBox. So both of those are apps you can download and kind of use it to adventure around Portland in a plastic-free way. Next, I wanted to share just a couple of upcoming events in Portland. So we have a James Neighborhood Recycling event, and that's on March 12th from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Again, I'm going to be sending links to this event where you're able to find all of this information plus more. But I think it's really relevant because they have comprehensive recycling that they do. And I just wanted to bring this up because we had a whole presentation on recycling. And this is kind of, I think, their main event for the next couple of months. So if you're kind of holding on to some of these recycling items that you can't put in your normal bin, this is a really good chance to kind of collect, bring them to the event, and show some support to the James Neighborhood Recyclers. And you can screenshot this or I'll be sending a list. Next, we have an online webinar hosted by Beyond Plastics. I think this webinar is going to be really interesting. It talks about global ocean plastic waste, which I mean, we didn't talk about in this presentation now, but I'm sure it's something that you've all heard about in the news. Plastic waste in the ocean and its effects on our health, on animal health, etc. It's a super hot topic right now. So I think this webinar is going to be really interesting. It's tomorrow from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. I'm hoping to attend, but if not, it's going to be recorded. I think it'll be a really worthwhile conversation to listen to, especially after the webinar we heard tonight. So I'm going to skip past here and you can register using that link there. But again, I'll be sending it again. Lastly, I wanted to share this event for Solve Oregon. So they do organized litter cleanups. And what I really like about them is they train everyone who hosts these litter cleanups so they know how to properly sort through the garbage and the recycling. And I think it's really important to be properly disposing of what we're picking up during litter cleanups, just so our impact is doing the most amount of good. So I really love Solve Oregon. You may have seen them previously as D-Trash Portland, I believe, but they've changed their names now. On their website, they have cleanups almost every day all over Portland. So if you're looking for something to do on a weekend, on a weekday, just to get outside, this is a great way to show some support to another awesome organization here in Oregon. And David mentioned this, but I would recommend everyone sign up for updates on ways to get involved with the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. I'll send the link to sign up for the emails on here, but they just post webinars, job postings, updates on the act. If this is something you're interested in following, it's a really good link to have. And they send an email a month, so you're not going to get bombarded. I know I'm going fast, but the last one is I just wanted to throw out a call to join our plastic reduction committee. My email's up there. We have our next meeting next month, Tuesday, the 8th at 6 p.m. Right now, we're working on creating content for our resource pages. So we're going to be building out some pages on the Climate Reality website. We're going to be hosting our own litter cleanup event through Solve Oregon, and that's something that's developing to be done towards Earth Day. And then right now we're working on creating a business outreach campaign to promote plastic-free alternatives in the food industry around Portland. So that's something that we're working on. And then at the end of this month, we'll be having a waste audit put together by Celeste Lewis. And that's hopefully going to be an activity people can do on their own and come back to our next meeting to discuss results about that. So it'll be a waste audit on our recycling bins to see if we're recycling anything improperly or if we can improve on anything. And I think it'll tie in great to that James recycling event. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and send all those links I just talked about. And I see things coming through the chat. I don't know if they're for me. Okay, perfect. I'm going to send those links here. If anyone wants to say anything, feel free to. Put this up here.
Would you?
Yeah, I think,
Oh.
are we wrapping up here, Zoe?
Yep, I'm done here. I'm just
Okay,
looking at the comments.
Are there any other questions? Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
Oh, would you just put your email in chat, Zoe? Would love to touch bases.
Of course. And I just put my email in there and I'm trying to get everyone who sent me a message copied down as well. But other than that, I don't think we have anything else to present as a group unless anyone wanted to throw in a question. I appreciate you all staying and listening to me shout a bunch of resources at you. Thanks for staying for the David presentation. I hope you all took away as much as I did.
It was terrific. So are you familiar with Ridwell, and did you look at their resources?
I did. Well, I haven't looked too much into it, but I see those boxes on everyone's porch. So it's on my radar for sure.
We have it. I really like it a lot.
I'll have to touch base with you, Karen, on that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they don't do apartments.
And they get pushback. Clackamas, I think, was the municipality who just outlawed Ridwell because the local waste company was not happy with the competition. Pretty terrible.
Contracts, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would love people to sit around and chat. I just want to officially kind of say our meeting's over. look forward to seeing you guys March 15th. We are nailing down our speaker for that, and I think it'll be interesting as well. So look forward to seeing you. Thanks for showing up today. And if you have any other conversations, go for it. I'll keep the Zoom link open.
Maybe I can take this opportunity now that the meeting's over to mention that I'm working on my presentation. I'll be doing a practice of my presentation about methane and natural gas. This Thursday at 7 p.m. If anybody's interested in hearing my presentation about natural gas 101, let's see, how do I make this work? I'll just mention my email in the chat, and then if you email me, then I can coordinate with you.
Yeah, I was able to get a preview from Kelly and it looks really interesting. I liked your PowerPoint presentation. So it'll probably be a really good presentation. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, put your email address, Kelly, in the chat. That'd be great.
Since we're now unofficial and post meeting, I would introduce myself. My name is Rick Gray. I live in Canada.